It's Thursday all across the Locked On Podcast Network. So for the NFL season, you know exactly what that means. It is crossover Thursday. We have Locked On Broncos talking with Locked On Texans about Sunday's big-time matchup, 2:25 p.m. Mountain Time kickoff. The Denver Broncos will host the Houston Texans. I'm Cody Roark, host of Locked On Broncos, joined alongside by Locked On Texans host Cody Davis. This is the Cody Show on today's crossover episode, my man. Obviously, very excited to welcome you here. Can't wait to break down welcoming the Texans audience, and also for Texans fans tuning in, they get to hear a little bit of a Broncos perspective, man. So, Cody, I want to start things off here with this crossover here today by really setting it up. For the Houston Texans, what is the biggest story for them this week as a team heading into this matchup?
Can they actually bounce back from not a loss, but a tie? That is the number one storyline heading into this game. And, you have to look at it from two different perspectives. Of course, here in the city of Houston, it's been a split point of conversation, whether or not Coach Lovie Smith made the right decision to settle for a tie. And when you go back and you take a look at everything that led up to Coach Smith's decision to say, you know what, I'm fine, don't want to lose this game, I want to settle for a tie. The one thing he talked about was everything that had led up to that decision, which means the fact that the Houston Texans blew a 20-3 lead, the fact that they gave up 200 and something yards in the fourth quarter to the Indianapolis Colts, and then also the fact that the Colts actually missed their opportunity to win this football game because of the missed field goal. However, with all that being said, the number one thing that I was looking into going into week one was whether or not a potential win or a potential loss was going to set up the atmosphere for the entire season. And that caught my attention because the one thing I remember defensive end Jonathan Grenard saying is the fact that this game against the Indianapolis Colts, whether we win or lose, is going to show us what we are working with for this entire season. Well, in the first three quarters, it seems like you was working with something good. The fourth quarter, it seemed like you was like you was a rebuilding team. And in overtime, you settled for a tie. So we're kind of back at square one to say, okay, will the Houston Texans be better than what we expect, or would they still be one of the worst teams in the league?
I think that's an interesting thing to set up. I know for me, when I was watching that game, I was tuning in because I wanted to see running back Dameon Pierce from a scouting perspective. I wanted to see Davis Mills because at the end of last season, I was watching him in the red zone. He had the highest passer rating in the red zone amongst quarterbacks last year, and I think that was an impressive sign. There's things that they built upon. I'm a big Pep Hamilton fan. I think that he's been a huge proponent of quarterback success, and so I was very tuned into this game. Not to mention, I did have the Colts on the money line, and I was hoping that my bet wasn't going to fall through. So they did make it interesting that fourth quarter. But for the biggest story here for this Denver Broncos football team is also a week of kind of some questions from the fan base, questions from the media about Broncos head coach Nathaniel Hackett's decision to try to kick a 64-yard field goal to try to win the game against the Seahawks versus letting Russell Wilson go for it on 4th and 5. There's been the mental gymnastics that we've been playing all week on our end, but for this Denver Broncos football team, the biggest story this week as it pertains to themselves, going against this Houston Texans team, can they come into week 2 playing more disciplined football to open up the season on Monday Night Football? They had 12 penalties that accounted for over 120 yards lost. Seattle Seahawks had 19 first downs in that game. 7 of them were due to penalties by the Denver Broncos. So that was not an ideal situation for the Broncos to find themselves in, but also it was the turnovers in the red zone. The Broncos had the ball on the 1-yard line twice in this game, and then Melvin Gordon, Javonte Williams, each of those guys had a fumble that cost them points and cost them an opportunity to win the football game. So for them, it's how can the offense bounce back? Even though they put up over 430 plus total yards of offense, the production, the point totals were not there that matched that output. So it's a big week for this Broncos team against the Houston Texans. And more so, we found out earlier this week, Justin Simmons placed on injured reserve for the Broncos defensively, a massive blow for them on the back end of the Broncos secondary unit. Obviously a captain for them, and now they're going to have to replace his production by having some other guys step up and fill in at his position. But these two storylines for both of these teams, Cody, will set the table, I think, for this matchup on Sunday when all the action kicks off. And for Broncos fans, for Texans fans, coming up here in just a moment, Cody and I, we are also going to break down the key matchups that we are looking forward to most seeing in Sunday's action between the Denver Broncos and the Houston Texans. But before we get into that, let us tell you about Turo, the sponsor of today's episode, Locked On Broncos, Locked On Texans crossover series. And Turo is the world's largest car sharing marketplace. And with Turo, you can book any car you want, whether you want it from a community of local hosts. You can browse a huge selection of vehicles for just about any occasion or budget across the U.S., Canada, and the UK. You can book a spacious SUV or minivan for a family road trip. You can get a classic or luxury car for a special event, a birthday, or holiday. You can find affordable economy cars if you're on a budget and just need to get from A to B. Test drive that new electric vehicle that you've had your eye on to see how it fits in your everyday life. And many Turo hosts can even deliver the car right to you. Every trip is backed by liability insurance. Terms, conditions, and exclusions apply. So ditch the boring rental cars and find your drive at Turo.com. Continuing on with our Locked On Broncos, Locked On Texans crossover event here for week 2 across the Locked On Podcast Network. Thank you, everyone, for making Locked On Broncos or Locked On Texans your first listen of the day every single day, free and available everywhere you get your podcasts or whether you watch both shows on YouTube. We appreciate you so much. Continuing our conversation here, Cody, from a Locked On Texans perspective, what are some key matchups? It could be one key matchup, it could be two that you have your eye on the most here for your Houston Texans against the Denver Broncos this upcoming Sunday.
The one matchup or two matchups that I'm looking at, and they kind of go hand in hand. Courtland Sutton, Jerry Jeudy versus Derek Stingley and Steven Nelson. Throughout this whole entire year, as a matter of fact, ever since the Houston Texans got the number 3 overall pick, everyone in their mind knew that the Houston Texans were going to address one of their top priorities, which is the secondary. And they did that, of course, by drafting Derek Stingley Jr. Now, Derek Stingley Jr. did have a pretty solid debut against the Indianapolis Colts. I understand he did give up a few receptions, but of course, it was his very first game. He is still trying to get adjusted to the NFL level. But what I would say is he did finish that game with 7 tackles. And to me, he was one of the saviors of the Indianapolis Colts game, because had he not recorded a touchdown pass deflection between Matt Ryan and rookie wide receiver Alex Pierce, then the Indianapolis Colts would have left NRG Stadium with the victory. But the fact that he was able to get his hand on that ball, that basically saved the game for the Houston Texans. And of course, I'm pretty sure you saw it. Lovie Smith called them up and said, hey, we're going to take you. We're going to have you cover the number 1 wide receiver for this upcoming season. And of course, on the opposite side of the line of scrimmage, you're looking at Jerry Jeudy, a guy that literally is coming off a game where he had 105, 110 receiving yards. And of course, now you are pairing him with a Hall of Fame quarterback in Russell Wilson. I think that this is going to be a phenomenal season for Jerry Jeudy. And of course, hopefully that breakout game does not come against the Houston Texans. And of course, that is going to be whether or not, or how much I should say, Derek Stingley is going to be able to contain him. And of course, on the opposite side, it's not like that you could just worry about Jerry Jeudy. You also got to worry about Courtland Sutton. And I've been saying this ever since the Houston Texans signed this young man, Steven Nelson, at least as for right now, he has been one of, if not the Texans' best offseason acquisition. Not only is he showing it on the field, but he is showing it off the field as well, showing Derek Stingley the ropes. And this is a guy who is one of the leaders in the locker room, and he's still a productive player. And in order for the Houston Texans to be able to come out with a victory against the Denver Broncos, they're going to have to contain the Broncos' top 2 receivers.
Well, and another question I have for you, too, as it pertains to like an offensive matchup, right? For Davis Mills, who's running the offense there in Houston, are there any matchups in particular you're also looking forward to, whether it be Davis Mills, whether it be Damian Pierce, whether it be Rex Burkhead, who just seems to find a way to be heavily involved in offensive game plans going forward?
It's not too much of a matchup that I'm looking at in terms of Davis Mills, but what I do want to say in terms of Davis Mills going into this game, I want to know how is he going to be able to improve his ability to create something out of nothing And by that I mean when he is being pressured. When you go back to that game against the Indianapolis Colts, there were several times where he did not handle the pressure well. And he said something very interesting during his media availability on yesterday. He said that he watched the Seattle Seahawks and Denver Broncos game, and he said that what he noticed about Geno Smith was every time the Broncos pressured him, he was able to use his leg and move around in the pocket and to be able to still make something out of nothing. And when I take a look at Davis Mills, yes, he has the ability to do so, but a lot of time he is a statue, and that puts a lot of pressure on the offensive line. And he said that is something that he wants to work on. So going into week 2, I'm holding him by his words to see whether or not that is something that he's going to improve at.
From a Locked On Broncos perspective, some of the key matchups I'm most looking forward to seeing here. I think for the Broncos defensively, I think they have to find a way to limit O.J. Howard, because in the week 1 opening game against the Seattle Seahawks, the Broncos allowed 2 touchdown passes to 2 different tight ends. Well, O.J. Howard had 2 catches for I think it was like 22, 24 yards, but 2 of his catches were for 2 touchdowns in the game against the Indianapolis Colts, which gave them obviously 14 points off of that. The Broncos historically have struggled in recent memory against tight ends, versatile, athletic, sizable tight ends. And kind of going to your point about Geno Smith, his escapability, making plays happen, when things break down, he did just that, and he was able to find tight ends. So I think our kind of key matchups align a little bit with the impact of maybe how certain things can go on field here. And certainly for the Broncos, they have to find a way to account for O.J. Howard. But I'm going to go with a little bit more of an exciting matchup here, Cody. Patrick Surtain taking on Brandon Cooks, who's got some long speed to him, some dynamic ability to him. Obviously, in my opinion, I think the Texans' best wide receiver. We saw him play against DK Metcalf, and kind of to your point about Derek Stingley didn't allow any explosive plays to the Indianapolis Colts. Patrick Surtain played against DK Metcalf, didn't allow any explosive plays, and held him to 37 yards total in Monday's loss, unfortunately, to the Seattle Seahawks. He's entering his second year as a pro. So I imagine we talk about like really young, exciting corners. You look at Derek Stingley now with the Houston Texans. You look at Patrick Surtain now with the Denver Broncos. I think that'll be a fun matchup to watch here for Denver. But a huge question and a huge matchup that I honestly have my eyes fixated on in this game has to be the Broncos edge rushers against Houston's offensive line, right? There's Laramie Tunsil, who's been a stakeholder for them at the left tackle position. What does the Texans offensive line look like here when they're going against guys like Randy Gregory and Bradley Chubb, and Chubb coming off of a very impressive 2-sack performance against the Seattle Seahawks?
Here's the thing. They don't even know, because they still dealing with communication issues. And I say that because, going back to Sunday's game against the Indianapolis Colts, there was a lot of times where it was easy to tell that the offensive line unit wasn't on the same accord. And on Tuesday, when we had an opportunity to talk to Justin Britt, whose status is in the air right now because he's dealing with something personal, so we might not even have an opportunity to see him. But when we had an opportunity to talk to him Tuesday during his media availability, Justin Britt talked about how the communication with the offensive line unit wasn't there. And he also talked about how it kind of hurt the offensive line that majority of those guys like Laramie Tunsil, like Justin Britt, did not play during the preseason in terms of getting back to that communication, getting back to that chemistry and camaraderie. And that's one of the things that I was kind of worried about, especially for a guy like Laramie Tunsil. Yes, he is still one of the best left tackles in the game, but Sunday was his very first game playing in the game since October, I think it was like 25th or somewhere along those lines, week 5 during the 2021 campaign. And for me personally, going into the offseason, going into training camp and all this other stuff, like, yes, they had a lot of time on the practice field, but Cody, there is nothing like getting in-game reps. And the fact that majority of the most important guys on that offensive line did not or barely play throughout the preseason, it hurt the Texans on Sunday. And I do believe it's going to hurt them again because, as I mentioned, Justin Britt, due to personal reason, he's not going to be there, and that's your starting center. Now, look, maybe Titus Howard, Laramie Tunsil, because they finally maybe they just needed that one game in hopes of getting their communication and everything back on track. But at the same time, look, you guys got a very scary defensive front, and this is going to be a very hard task for the Houston Texans offensive line.
Well, I think the Broncos are also dealing with a lot of questions after week one about not playing any of the starters in the preseason. I always believe that there's like the pros and cons, and certainly I think game reps are absolutely important.
Mhm.
But I feel like when you have a team that has the players like Denver, and we saw what happened to Zach Wilson in the preseason. Luckily, the
Mm.
New York Jets, they're going to be okay. They're going to overcome that eventually. They got to deal with Joe Flacco in the meantime, which I'm not jealous of in that situation. Denver was already in that boat. But I do think that this is going to be a matchup that is going to have a lot of interesting storylines coming into the game. And for the Broncos, how can you maybe have someone step up in place of Justin Simmons on the back end? I mean, he's your best defensive player outside of Patrick Surtain and Bradley Chubb, who, in the last couple of years, back-to-back seasons of 5 interceptions. That's going to be a huge, huge question heading into this matchup. But as it pertains to maybe what the Broncos or what the Texans need to do in order to come out on top for a victory, that's something we're going to dive deep into coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me tell you about BetOnline.net, the sponsor of today's crossover episode here on the Locked On Podcast Network. And BetOnline.net is your number one source for all your pro and college football betting needs and sports info this season. You can find all the latest football league developments, game matchups, news, and podcasts, including this year's opening week games. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. The fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite sports and events, including MLB, MMA, boxing, and golf. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action. Bet online, where the game starts. Continuing on with your Locked On NFL podcast, crossover edition, Locked On Broncos and Locked On Texans. Cody Roark here and Cody Davis. This is the Cody Show on the Locked On Podcast Network. We got things going here, breaking down the Denver Broncos matchup against the Houston Texans from both teams' perspectives. So, Cody, let me start off by asking you this. From the Locked On Texans perspective, what do the Texans need to do to come into Empire Field at Mile High on Sunday and get the Broncos off to an 0-2 start? What do they have to do in order to win?
Well, one, and this is, of course, the most important thing because it doesn't matter what they do on either side of the ball. The number one thing is, how do you contain Russell Wilson? This is a guy who is 3-0 against the Houston Texans as of right now. And I could be wrong, but outside of Rex Burkhead, I don't think there's not one player in that locker room who has ever beaten Russell Wilson. We had an opportunity to talk to Steven Nelson on Tuesday, and he said that Russell Wilson is one of the hardest quarterbacks to prepare for because, on one hand, he's a pocket quarterback, but on the other hand, he's a dual threat. So, if you put too much pressure on him, he can get out of it, and he's one of those quarterbacks I love saying he could create something out of nothing. And I go back to the game last year against the Seattle Seahawks, and I watched Russell Wilson attack the Houston Texans Tampa 2 defense, and he did something that every quarterback did, but it seemed like he did it better, and that was attack that Tampa 2 defense down the middle. And when I take a look at what Lovie Smith said about the enhancements that he made to his defense, I say, okay, I hear you, Lovie Smith, but last year, Russell Wilson destroyed the Texans inside of NRG Stadium, attacking that Tampa 2 defense down the middle. You say you made enhancements? I want to see enhancement. And I already know that Russell Wilson is probably going to go into Sunday's game against the Texans and saying, you know what? I'm going to just do what I did last year, attack them down the middle, and it's going to be an easy victory for the Denver Broncos. That's one thing, and by far the number one thing that the Texans have to do in hopes of getting this dub. Another thing, they say they want to be a running team. You got to play your best running back. There is no way in hell we should still see Rex Burkhead getting more carries than Dameon Pierce. I understand it. I get it. I understand Dameon Pierce has a way to go in terms of, using him as a pass catcher out of the backfield, as a pass blocker, or whatever the case might be. I understand all that. I understand he's still trying to learn majority of the playbook. But at the end of the day, if you're putting the hands in your running back and you want to get from the 10-yard line all the way to the 5-yard line or whatever the case might be, you want to get that first down, and you keep saying we can't establish the run. We can't establish the run. We can't establish the run. Every time you say we can't establish the run, there's only one running back that is always in this common denominator, and that's Rex Burkhead. If you want to establish the run, please use your most talented running back in Dameon Pierce. It's not that hard.
I love that too because, like I said, I thought Dameon Pierce put together a very impressive preseason format,
Yes,
and
he
I like
did.
his work, especially in college. Now, that'll be a challenge for this Denver Broncos team. So now, from a Locked On Broncos perspective, if the Broncos are going to want to win this game against the Houston Texans to get off to a 1-1 start on the season offensively, it has to be more disciplined. You have to be able to finish if you get in the red zone. The Broncos had 4 red zone trips and were 0 for 4. They had a fumble. They had another fumble in back-to-back drives. They had an incomplete pass where, the tight end Eric Tomlinson barely just had his foot on the line, and unfortunately it would have been out of bounds on a touchdown pass that would potentially win the game. And then you have to eliminate penalties. The Broncos had one touchdown that was eliminated offensively, a shovel pass to Andrew Beck because of a false start penalty that backed them up, forcing them to settle for a field goal that put them in a position to trail 17-16 against Seattle. You just have to be more disciplined and have to find a way to finish when you're in the red zone. Now, for the defensive side of the ball, it's quite simple. You have to get back to the basics. You have to get back to playing disciplined assignment football. Denver had several drives last week against the Seattle Seahawks as well, Cody, where they got to stop on third down, but then they got a penalty, whether it be, a rough in the passer call, whether it be a taunting penalty that extended the Seahawks drive. You can't have penalties on the defensive side of the ball, and you must be a little bit more disciplined in diagnosing where OJ Howard and the tight ends are, and you have to find a way to eliminate those big plays from happening. You mentioned it earlier. One of the key things, can Davis Mills get out of the pocket and make things happen with his legs? Denver has to be able to account for that. They just can't come into this matchup thinking, okay, Davis Mills is just going to be a statue guy. He's going to be a pocket passer. He's got the ability to get outside and to hurt you, and Denver must come home, stay disciplined, and play assignment football, in my opinion, if they want to win the ball. But Cody, let's recap this for the listeners of the Locked On Broncos podcast, Locked On Texans podcast, free and available everywhere people get their podcasts, or whether they watch both shows on YouTube. For the Broncos, the biggest story of the week heading into this game is Justin Simmons being placed on injured reserve. Who steps up in the back end of that secondary, and can Denver be more disciplined after committing too many mistakes against the Seattle Seahawks? That was one of the biggest keys. We also highlighted key matchups for this Broncos team. Patrick Surtain going against Brandon Cooks, the Texans' #1 wide receiver, and also accounting for where OJ Howard is lined up offensively. Find ways to punch it in, be more consistent. That was the perspective from the Broncos. From the Texans side, what did we recap?
First and foremost, how can the results of this game, hopefully not a tie, can actually set the tone for the Houston Texans moving forward? Of course, the biggest matchup everybody is looking at, Jerry Jeudy versus Derek Stingley Jr. And of course, what is the #1 thing that the Houston Texans must do in hopes of getting their first victory of the 2022 campaign? Can you contain Russell Wilson and not let him beat you attacking that Tampa 2 defense down the middle? And of course, just give the ball to Dameon Pierce and just get Rex Burkhead out of the way, please.
That's a big one. And obviously, if you're a Broncos fan, sound off in the comments below. If you're a Texas fan, sound off in the comments below. If you're watching this on the Locked On Broncos or Locked On Texans YouTube page. But this has been a crossover Thursday powered by our good friends over there at PrizePicks. Make sure you check out PrizePicks.com. Make sure you use promo code LOCKEDON to receive a 100% deposit match bonus when you sign up today. Daily fantasy sports done right. Cody, I'm looking forward to Sunday's matchup against the Houston Texans from a Broncos perspective. I'm excited that I was able to break this matchup down with you. Broncos fans learned a lot from the Texans perspective, and I hope Texans fans learned a lot from the Broncos perspective going into week 2, 2:25 p.m. Mountain Time kickoff, 4:25 p.m. Eastern Time kickoff on CBS.